Good morning and welcome. My name is Clint Vince and I chair Dentons Energy Practice and I co-chair our global transportation and infrastructure sector. I'm so honored today to be having a conversation with my good friend Jonathan Pershing, who truly is one of the great leaders for the environment, climate, and beyond. And his accomplishments have been really extraordinary. We're co-sponsoring this event today as part of the Keystone Policy Center's Key Conversations program, and also the Dentons Law Firm's Smart Cities and Connected Communities Roundtable series. Our think tank is, our Smart Cities think tank has grown to more than 800 thought leaders in 86 countries. Jonathan Pershing is currently the director of environment at the Hewlett Foundation. And he took a leave of absence in 2021 and 2022 to serve with the President's Special Envoy on Climate, John Kerry. And during that time, Jonathan assisted in a major way with the Glasgow Climate Pact, the global methane pledge, which included more than 100 countries, and also a very important declaration between China and the United States at a time when our relationship with China was and still is very frosty. Prior to that, Jonathan was a special envoy for climate change at the State Department, and he played a major role in helping to secure the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. Before that, Jonathan was the senior climate advisor to the Department of Energy, and near and dear to my heart before that, Jonathan was heading up a program for climate and the environment with the World Resources Institute, and I served on their board for many years. Jonathan has a PhD in geology and geophysics. And Jonathan, we have plenty to talk about this morning. This is probably the most dramatic sea change that I have observed in my lifetime between presidents, especially with respect to climate, but so many other subjects. I think it is a incredible sea change in policy. I don't use that word lightly. For a couple of decades, I served with a ocean racing team, so I have sailed through sea changes, and they are tumultuous, powerful, dramatic, and sometimes dangerous. Mm-hmm. So, Jonathan, what are your observations on this sea change in policy between President Biden and President Trump?
Well, let me start off by thanking you for that very warm introduction. It's great to be here. Great to have a chat with you. It's actually a pretty interesting moment to think about having this conversation. There are a few things that I'd say. We're just a few weeks in. And so in some ways, I don't think we really yet know what the long-term play is going to be. What we've got are some near-term signals. We've got some indicators from the campaign. We've got statements made by newly appointed, some cases not yet even in place, members of the president's new cabinet. We've got reactions from the global community, and I'm happy to speak a bit about some of those items. But what it appears to be is a fairly wholesale administration rejection of both the role of government in climate policy, but in fact, at a more fundamental level, the importance of climate to begin with as any part of an agenda. What I find in some ways the most interesting about that is that I don't think we've ever been as certain as we are today about the state of the climate. In some ways, it's this inverse relationship. The more certain we are, the more the opposition to working on this agenda has grown. And it's this backlash and this complicated relationship that I think we're currently seeing. Having said that, the United States right now is just over 10, it's about 11% of global emissions. And so in some sense, what the United States chooses or doesn't choose to do may be as importantly defined by how it engages with the rest of the world as whether or not the change here will fundamentally alter the global trajectory, because the U.S. isn't that big a share anymore. When I began working on this in the late 1980s, the United States was between 25 and 30% of the total. So if we think about this agenda in some ways as a relative weighting, the big player now is China, with almost 30% of global emissions. And China is moving faster than any other country has ever moved in the direction of replacing its energy systems, mostly with zero carbon emissions. Opportunities like wind, like solar, building nuclear power, working on a whole series of large-scale transmission capacity. China has enough capacity to provide the entire world with those technologies. And in fact, in some ways, what we're seeing now is a backlash, not so much against climate, but against the fact that China dominates that energy system. So those kinds of questions are the ones that I think we want to get into. One last thing that I'd say is that I don't think this is a good thing for the United States. My personal view is that the damage that is caused, not just from the climate agenda, but from the larger conversation about, is the U.S. a reliable partner? How do you think about American investment in countries around the world? But how do you think about it as a partner for the private sector within the United States? Contracts are being halted. Programs that had been launched with good faith commitments on the part of companies are being halted or rescinded. And in some cases, an indication they'd like to claw back funds that were already committed. Communities that depend on the government for activity, not only in climate, but broadly, are left uncertain. And in the uncertainty, I think there's a great deal, not just of economic difficulty, but of personal chaos and a trend that's, I think, going to be a little bit hard to reverse, even when we get back to a more even keel.
Let's talk about the international landscape and then come back a little bit to domestic. In addition to China, what do you see happening with other countries in reaction to our withdrawal from Paris and our other activities, India and sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere?
So in some ways, I think the interesting thing we have to be aware of is that the president's commitment to withdraw takes some time to move forward. The technicalities of the agreement mean that he has indicated and has notified the UN of his intent to do so, but the rule internationally is that it's a full year after the notification until the formal withdrawal takes effect. So technically, the United States will be in the agreement through this entire year. Practically, it means that will they send a delegation? Will they send participants to the next rounds of meetings? Will they engage in dialogue on this issue? We don't really know yet. That's unclear. Secretary Rubio has not been explicit. He has not so far. They've shut down the envoy's office, but not the climate change office inside the Bureau of Oceans, Environment, and Science at the State Department. We don't know what that's going to look like. Park that for a moment because the intent is clear and the legalities in some ways are less essential to countries' understanding than the intent the United States has got. We're seeing two or three different things. The first one is that while there has been some indication that a few countries might follow suit, the broad direction is that no country has yet withdrawn. Even those that indicated they might have pulled back from that commitment. There were a couple that were fairly explicit. The most recent large-scale international negotiations took place after the election, but before the inauguration. It was held in Baku in Azerbaijan. At that meeting, the Argentine delegation received instructions from Buenos Aires to say, we're not going to be part of this. But then they sent another message saying, actually, that was hasty. We do intend to be part of it. So here was the one country with an explicit move in that direction, and President Milei from Argentina went back and forth on that. No other country has even gotten that far. Now, it's a little early still. What will that look like? We don't know. The second piece is that countries are supposed to have, by the middle of this year, their next round of reports about the new, in theory, updated and upgraded commitments on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and on the policies that would support that reduction and on efforts to adapt to climate. We're supposed to report on this, and that report is due in 2025. What we are currently seeing is there may be less ambition. And that ambition is in part predicated on expectations that the United States may be pulling back. And if the US pulls back, how far forward do they want to be? But even here, there's ambiguity. So, for example, we've already got indications that the UK intends to do a very aggressive, it looks like it will be either an 85% or even a 90% reduction in their greenhouse gas emissions by 2035, which is incredibly ambitious. We don't have clear indication of China. We thought they'd early on perhaps announce their new targets and their new expectations by the middle of next month. We now think it'll be a bit delayed as they reevaluate and reconsider. What looks clear is that the Chinese trend of greenhouse gas emissions has flattened and could plausibly reduce. Last year was their single largest ever installation of renewables. The renewables installed in China just last year are larger than the entire German energy demand. So just scale here is extraordinary, and all indications are that 2025 will be bigger than 2024. Now, energy demand is increasing, so they're seeing the need for all that new power, just as energy demand is increasing in the United States. But we're seeing those kinds of shifts, but the trajectory for their clean energy is rapid. India's harder. India's less explicit. I think that India is looking a lot at investment. India is looking at meeting its commitment for large-scale renewable energy. They've got a commitment for 500 gigawatts of clean power. They're moving down that road. They're going to have a hard time getting there, but they're moving. So those things, I think, are a little bit less clear.
What are the 2 or 3 things that you see on the landscape that concern you, and what are some of your proposed solutions to tackle them?
So I think I divide that into maybe 2 buckets. The first bucket is that the climate agenda, just because there's an administration that doesn't like it, is really independent of the politics. The physics and the science say that if you keep adding greenhouse gas emissions, you will continue to see temperatures increase. There's been a really interesting story that came out yesterday, day before yesterday, which talked about a warm spell in the Arctic. And the Arctic this year has the lowest winter ice levels ever recorded. So that's the first point. And it was 20 degrees above normal. It was right about freezing. Now, for people who know the Arctic in February, freezing in the Arctic in February is not where you're supposed to be. You're supposed to be many degrees below zero. And this was just at freezing. They're seeing melting in the Arctic in February. Kind of extraordinary. All indications that this is what we should expect to see. The wildfires in LA, clearly exacerbated by a drought that appears climate related. The dynamics of flooding in the American Midwest, or what we're seeing now in Central Europe, clearly exacerbated by climate. We expect more of those. That won't change. And so to me, the fact that a president doesn't want to work on it won't really affect the problem. The second is the one that I think he is responding to. And that has to do with a global concern around energy prices, around security and reliability, around questions of whether or not the competitive economy in the energy sector advantages any given country. And we're seeing this play out not just in the United States. Energy prices in Europe are remarkably high, partly because of Russia and Ukraine, but partly because of demand increases, this increase in data requirements. Interestingly, the Department of Energy's Energy Information Administration released a report at the end of last year which looked at what drove energy price increases in the United States. The number one factor, not data. The number one factor was that climate-induced temperature increases led people to add more air conditioning. So here's a really interesting statistic that brings the two together. But people saw higher energy prices, and the American grid isn't ready for that. And American supply isn't prepared to provide that. And in the future, this data demand is growing. So all of these things tie in. And how do you address that? That's an area that I think we're open to. I think if you listen to the message that Chris Wright provided to the Department of Energy staff, came out yesterday, if you think about the dynamics of new transmission expectations, those are things we actually might see move forward, but those will also open the door to the installation of low carbon solutions.
Chris Wright, of course, is our new Secretary of Energy, and he has, I think, surprised skeptics in a positive way so far, is my take. What you've begun to move into the domestic approach on climate and energy and beyond, and the importance of it. What role do you see at the subnational level to address or maybe represent a counterweight to some of the things the current administration is seeking to do on climate? And by subnational, I mean states, attorneys general in litigation and groupings, political subdivisions, cities, counties, and so on.
Yeah. So, listen, I think that there are clear lines of authority that the city's got. Those have to do often with things like zoning, that the state has got. States employ taxes, have their own revenue structures, determine things like some of the energy policy within the state. And that the federal government has got, which is not least around its purse and its power to provide grants and its structure of loan programs and that dynamic. But all of these various levels of government have both authorities and responsibilities. At the state level, what we've seen in this initial few weeks is attorneys general, at the behest often of governors, but sometimes because they've got their own networks and structures, pushing back against certain executive orders, arguing before the courts that they're unconstitutional. We've seen that with respect in particular to the constitutionality of birthright citizenship, but I think we're also beginning to see it in some other domains. The governors have also gotten together and talked about things that they can do as a way to push back. Having said that, these are often very partisan, where you've got governors from Democratic states, Democratic-led governors pushing strongly, and Republican governors at the moment relatively comfortable with the transition. So that partisan nature, I think, gets down to a state level. It's not just reflected in Congress. Having said that, the states that are pushing forward represent about 60% of the American economy. This alliance of states that have agreed that they want to see this agenda continue, significant share of the economy, although a slightly smaller share of emissions. Emissions tend to be more concentrated in industrial centers, which are often more Republican-led. Cities are also moving forward. You end up with cities like New York and San Francisco, but also like Austin, Texas. You've got some really interesting things happening here in Boulder. You've got some really interesting questions that play out at the subnational and city and local level. What do I do with building efficiency? How do I think about the requirements for public transit? Now, many of those things have been contingent on funding from the federal government. And at the moment, with the pause in all federal funding, it's very hard to see political or, frankly, financial wherewithal to implement. There's a second question, and that's the political one. Will these communities, will the leaders of these communities want to push back, and how hard? We saw a very interesting example of the president's willingness to push on states when he talked to California. And the quid pro quo for providing aid to Los Angeles in its effort to recover from the fires was that they release water from the north to the south. Now, my personal view is that all the data suggests that that will have zero effect on the fires. In fact, it'll remove water, which at the moment is somewhat in short supply in the north. They're worried about the adequacy of this year's rainfall. So that farming community in the north is distraught. The water only went as far as the middle of the state, and then it stopped because that's where it ends up. None of it moved to LA. So I have these kinds of questions about, is the policy designed to push states to a useful outcome, or merely to be more to try to drive certain agendas that may or may not be tied to the needs the states might identify?
What role, Jonathan, do you see for philanthropy in the midst of this confusion, politically, domestically, and internationally? I noticed, for example, that Mike Bloomberg offered to supply funding with respect to the Paris Accord.
Yeah. So Mike Bloomberg has actually done this before. During the last Trump administration, the first Trump administration, they also withdrew from the Paris Agreement. And at that time, the Bloomberg Philanthropies made up the U.S. contribution to that portfolio. It's a non-trivial number. It's about $20 million, which from the government's purse, as we look at $1 trillion budget, is not really relevant. And even for someone like Mike Bloomberg, that's a very manageable cost. But philanthropy is tiny. If we think about the relative scale of all philanthropic dollars globally for everything on climate, it's probably at about $5 billion per year. If we think about the cost cutting that's been established just for USAID, that's on the order of $50 billion. So just globally from one agency, which is a small one in the US pantheon, philanthropy can't make it up. Now, having said that, philanthropy is in a unique place. Philanthropy is able and is part of an ecosystem. It's not itself that it's got the power, but it has supported all sorts of different institutions. And I want to be clear, philanthropy is not, in this instance, particularly partisan. Philanthropy supports organizations on the left, the center, the right of the political spectrum. Hewlett does all of that. We've supported a whole group of Republicans who favor climate policy. They have a set of actions that they believe are really relevant. They look at the freedom to choose what energy systems you have in your property. They look at the need for transmission and American competitiveness through a strong electricity grid. They've been longtime partners for us. And we support people who are looking at state policy. And we are not limited in that regard to states that actually have climate policy. We're looking at ones that have policies across the board because our view is that climate shouldn't be partisan. It's a scientific problem, a social problem, and one that affects the welfare of communities. And I think in some underlying fundamental way, the original charters that philanthropies have is to serve the public good through charitable purpose. And that has driven us, not the partisan outcome. Now, having said that, in many ways, we have not changed the thinking. We didn't decide that with a new administration, climate policy should be downgraded. We look at the science, we look at the costs and the benefits globally, and we will continue to make investments in those spaces, as will the climate philanthropy community as a whole. So I don't see a big shift. What I do think is there'll be two different tacks. One, very likely to move money out of the United States, because at the end of the day, if this administration doesn't want to engage, how effective can philanthropy be? But other countries have not done that. Very open to looking at policies and support that might really help them and help their communities adapt to climate, but also mitigate the emissions. The second thing that I think we'll see is areas where there may be alignment. We actually, in my program, fundamentally agree that the American grid is insufficient to meet future demand. Whatever you choose for the demand, whether you wanted it to be a gas demand, or a geothermal demand, or a nuclear demand, or a wind and solar demand. We think that that capacity needs to be enhanced. We think the same thing is true for critical minerals. The supply chain of critical minerals is inadequate for the transition. It turns out also to be inadequate to provide a secure source for health reasons or for military reasons. So we may find common cause here with an administration that is seeking to promote that. We will look across that spectrum. But we'll also continue to argue that the climate change agenda actually has consequence. And we're not proposing to back away from it because there's a disagreement.
And Jonathan, we are meeting here today in Boulder, Colorado, actually during the meetings of the Keystone Policy Center's Energy Board. We will, in fact, be having a discussion later with the very helpful Republican group that you mentioned that you've been supporting, or one of them, and on the subject of climate. And we are tackling a bunch of other very significant energy and environmental related issues. What role Keystone was really founded to bring together stakeholders with dramatically opposed interests. And they managed to get stakeholders from all 360 degrees on the compass. And they are tackling some very significant societal issues, including climate. What role do you suggest for the Keystone Policy Center in helping to address some of the concerns that you've raised today?
So, listen, I think that one of the most troubling aspects that has been increasing over my work on these agendas, and that now spans almost 40 years, that one of the most troubling aspects has been the increasingly partisan nature of the debate and the increasing difficulty of speaking across those differences. And one of the things that I think is absolutely essential is to find a place where you can have a reasoned, thoughtful dialogue. One of the things that I am struck by is that if you get away from labels, if you stop talking about is it Democratic or Republican, or is it woke or not, people actually agree on so much. And we tend to lose the agreement because the language or the terminology or the perception of my guys don't agree, so I have to agree with them. But if you get beneath that and start to unpack it, you start finding common ground. I think that's essential, and I think Keystone can do that. Let's talk about just a couple of the pieces there. So one of the things that's really interesting has, in my experience with Keystone, been some of the conversations with utilities. They come, they engage. The investors who are in the energy space come, they engage. They have clear bottom line concerns. They're concerns about their competitiveness. They're concerns about the government role that either limits or enhances their capacity to succeed, their commercial opportunities. They're also serving communities that have been devastated in some cases. I use PG&E as an interesting example. PG&E is likely to be whacked with part of the costs of the California LA fires, because it looks now as if at least one of the two fires may have been sparked by some power lines. So we've seen this game before. It happened all the way through Northern California. We've seen the dynamics of what that does. They're interested in solving this problem. They can't operate under these circumstances, and they're aware of government constraints and what they can possibly do. So here are now some really interesting opportunities. Citizens would like it. Companies would like it. Utility regulators would like it. If you can get below that kind of arbitrary framing, I think we can do something real. And I think dialogues and engagement and the bringing together of people across difference is essential.
Let's go deeper into this subject for just a moment. What role do you recommend, or what things need to be done by civil society overall to lean into the issues we've been discussing today?
So civil society takes, I think, a very broad swath, and we have to, I think, do a little bit of separation. Civil society includes essentially anybody who's not government. How do I think about the business voice? Is it the umbrella groups that represent a coalition of industry? Sure. They may not have a single common interest, but they have overlapping interests. That's why they band together and think about how to reflect those and learn about their differences and learn about what they want to collectively do and from each other. There's a separate voice, which is civil society as part of the advocacy community. People who are local, and most of our advocates are in fact local. The vast majority of NGOs are town-based and civic organizations that sit in some community and worry about a very particular aspect of the community's development. Was the road cleared after the last flood? When the bridge went out, did the authorities do something for that? Is the water clean to drink? What happens to that smokestack with the pollution right next to my kid's school? How do I think about the mine trucks that kind of cross my property? That's where most advocacy actually occurs. We tend to talk about the big national organizations, and they're very important. They provide information. They often can help with coordination. But the vast majority of advocacy is quite local. That's a civil voice. It's going to still be there. You then have advocates of a different sort. What do you do with your academics? I don't think we have the understanding, even across most of our questions, that we need. How do you solve these problems? I don't think people disagree that they want the prices low and they want it to be clean. Those are both at the bottom agreed. How do we do that? That's very hard. And what kind of policies do you put in? I think we need the smartest minds out there in our collective academic and policy think tanks giving input to that. It'll be a debate, but we want it to be rigorous and thoughtful. That too is a civil society program. So as I look at this, I think this voice has to come up. This voice has to be elevated. These questions have to be tackled head on, not in the intent of stifling the discussion, but of growing one that might lead to a more productive and sustained outcome.
And as Keystone does so well, at least narrowing the differences, even if we can't get to a complete consensus. Jonathan, Once I argued a case at the Supreme Court, and they told me to be effective, I needed to boil my entire argument down to one sentence. If we were to close out here, what would be one or two or three sentences that really represent the theme you most want to convey to the folks listening today?
So I want to know which justice asked that particularly pithy question.
I hired a coach, and he told me that that's what I should do in my opening argument. He said I'd have
boil it down.
He said I'd have about 30 seconds before I started receiving questions. It was the best single piece of advocacy advice I've ever received.
Yeah, we talk about it often as the elevator speech. What can you do? And this is one that I've done for pitches, where you have the moment you get into the elevator to the moment the CEO gets off at the top. It's 30 seconds. What are you going to say? So the short answer for me on this agenda is it didn't go away. We have an obligation to the American people and to our children in particular, and to the generations to come, to fix this problem, because if it gets worse, there are dire consequences. And we actually have solutions to this problem that will make life better. We should take them.
And ladies and gentlemen, you can see why the Keystone Policy Center, in its wisdom, gave Jonathan one of their most prestigious leadership awards last summer during their gala awards dinner. Thank you so much for being here with us.
It's a pleasure. And thanks so much.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
Nice to be here.
I do want to mention in closing that this is the 50th anniversary of the Keystone Policy Center. And at their next awards dinner in June, we will be celebrating that. If you want to learn more about the Keystone organization, go to keystone.org.